Hi there, and welcome to a new episode of Impact Talks. Today we have Pieter Wolters with us. He's the managing director of DSM Venturing. He's also a startup founder, an investor, and many other things. I'm really excited to have you on. Pieter, please introduce yourself and tell the people what you do.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I really look forward to this conversation, wherever it may lead us. Like you said, I'm the managing director of venturing at a Dutch company, originally Dutch company, I should say. It's a global company, DSM. We have a large portfolio of startup investments, so we're a little bit like a venture capital firm working strategically with us as our main investor, DSM. That is my job. I'm also very much still a startup entrepreneur, which is what I did until I joined DSM. Like you said, I co-founded and was CEO of a number of companies. I live in Boston since 7 years. Before that, I was in California for about 10 years. We moved there with the family with one of the startups I was with after we did an acquisition in the US. So I'm sort of professionally more American probably, but culturally still the accent is Dutch, and that is my nationality. So I've lived in different places, but the roots are still there as well. So it's a blend of things.
So when the Formula One was happening, you're still cheering for Max?
Well, I have to admit, we don't have a cable box here, so I don't watch live sports very often. But I happened to be in the Netherlands when he was racing at Zandvoort. And with the neighbors there, we had a good afternoon. And it's interesting to see such a young guy being at that world level. Wow, what a promise.
Right. Quickly about you, one of the most interesting bits, and I love introducing people not only in the investment sphere, but actually people who have done it successfully, and then transitioned into the next kind of giving back generation. And I feel like if I look at your career, that's kind of what you are doing. But before we dive into what you're doing right now, I'd love for the listeners to dive into your past. How did you start? How did you end up where you are today? Maybe, can you dive into your startup stories? And did it start when you studied, or can you tell us your first story within startups?
Yeah. So I was a bit late to the game with startups. I don't consider myself a thoroughbred startup guy after birth, if you will. I had a career for about 10 years, more in larger company, business, some law, some transaction practice. That's where I learned a lot of skills, I think. And then, early 30s, became a CFO of a startup through a connection with a VC. It was a spin out of a university in the Netherlands, actually, where the VC insisted with the first million that there would be somebody on the business side next to the two professors who were spinning out the company. It was a big step. I remember, I was always wearing a suit until then, going to an office. Everything looked very organized, and it was a good career I was on. But I was getting very impatient with getting things done and really having the impact I was looking for. So took a big pay cut, about 50%, a verbal agreement on some stock at some point. And there we went, and it was a roller coaster. I was there, so we're talking now 1997. We raised from European and American investors about 20 million. It was a tissue engineering company, I should say. So we were making living bone and cartilage and skin of your own cells, of the patient's own cells, and then growing on scaffolds, so to really mimic living tissue rather than using all kinds of artificial materials. Like I said, it was a roller coaster. We grew from that small research group to at the high about 300 people. Then we were in the US, in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, had products in patients, and also started building a sales organization. Took the company public, actually several times, first in Amsterdam, then through a merger in Toronto and in Lausanne, and ultimately to NASDAQ, and then sold in 2007. So it was a 10-year journey, but very different renditions of the same principle on different continents, different countries, but also with different products and very different people. So I with hindsight, I say, didn't know much when I started there at all. I don't want to speak too much for others, but I think we were all pretty inexperienced in the startup world, and we learned fast and furious by making quite a few mistakes. But and this is still a motto I strongly believe in. You don't have to do everything right, as long as you learn and as long as you don't repeat the same mistakes, and accept some help to prevent a few mistakes here and there from people who've already went before you. Anyway, after that, I wanted to take a little while off because it had been quite intense, and it wasn't all glamorous as sometimes it sounds when you take companies public, etc. We had a few challenges, especially here in America. So I thought I needed some rest, and as things go, ran into another opportunity with computer-assisted surgery. So still in the medical field, and a nice IP portfolio with a disposable device instead of a big operating theater system. And I lived in California at the time and started with an engineer in the garage. So a little bit that kind of story. This was in 2008, and we thought, okay, we'll call a few of the investors that we know and raise the first money, raise the Series A, and then Lehman Brothers. That whole thing happened in October, so it became a very rough year actually. But we were able to raise the A round, maybe not from the kind of money that we had hoped for initially, but still the fact that it worked was good. And I did that for about 3 years in California. Got through FDA approval, got through the first few thousand sales, and then decided to move on to next opportunities. And around that time, I reconnected with people at DSM I knew, and decided to go to the other side of the table.
So I really like that short sketch because it will give us obviously a lot of questions for me to ask. The first thing I wanted to ask, which you kind of started covering, but not completely, which is, what did you learn in your previous career that really helped you within your startup career? And also you mentioned you were quite inexperienced. So do you feel like you needed that career, or could you have started much earlier?
That second part is definitely an interesting question. I think the general skill set of... I have legal training as a background. I worked a lot in transactions. So I think in this particular case with with Isotis, the startup that we were in, and also in view of the fact that we did a few acquisitions and mergers, that really helped a lot actually. By that time, with intervals, I was CFO and interim CEO, and then CFO, business development, and ultimately CEO of the whole group. It had helped that I knew how to work those processes, the principles of working with all the advisors that get involved when you go public, when you acquire a company, and ultimately when you get acquired. The second part of the question, I'm going to make it very black and white. Did I waste 10 years before jumping into the startup scene?
Well, yeah, pretty much.
Maybe it could have been shorter. But I think for this particular route, and definitely for what I do now, it was very valuable training. And a little bit about me personal, I do acknowledge totally that we were pretty inexperienced in the startup, but I felt a certain confidence level, knowing at least a part where I could go back and sort of lean on. And I need that. I'm a generalist, so this is sometimes a regret I have that I didn't become a very technical person or an inventor. All those things could have been different paths as well. But I still like to know what I'm talking about, to have the confidence to share opinions and take decisions. So I don't go completely from the gut, if you will.
I like that, and I'm very similar. So when you were actually then starting out within the startup, what were some moments that you were thinking, okay, well, if I had started sooner, maybe we would have dodged that bullet, or maybe share some failures that you had. The story. I like listening to stories, so maybe some big learning lessons that you learned that you can share with the listeners here.
Yeah. Well, in startups, and even more so in startups where you make stuff that goes into people's bodies, it's very multidisciplinary, right? So you're dealing with the whole gamut of sometimes much larger, bigger enterprises where they have specialists for everything. In a startup, you don't, right? You look to the left, you look to the right, there's your colleagues, and that's it. So there were definitely areas, I would say, in the complexity that we knew by thinking logically and by people giving us advice from the board and the investors that were going to be important. But we didn't fully grasp until having gone through it a few times how impactful it can be if you don't have your ducks in a row there, or if maybe systems and circumstances just don't allow you to do something. And for instance, with the technology that we had at Isotis, we had it in working in the lab. We had it working in patients. What we, with hindsight, probably underestimated is how tough it would be to get it approved for wide use from a regulatory perspective, and maybe even more importantly, to get it reimbursed by insurance companies. Because you're at the start, right? You're making stuff that's really expensive to make if you do only one or two. So you're trying to start scaling and getting the cost down at larger scale. But the formal aspects of getting reimbursement, especially in Europe at the time, I don't know how it is now as well, were really, really tough. And so that was one of the motivations actually to at some point cross over to the US, because at least there you have a very large and homogeneous market where some of those mechanisms are more predictable. Still very tough, but a little bit more predictable. So that was definitely one. Another one, this was completely me, I would say. My inexperience with sales in this space. I really struggled hiring the right blend of very experienced people with people who were more innovative in their approaches in what is a very traditional surgeon-driven sales process, but where also hospitals and insurers and everybody plays a role in making decisions to buy something or not. That was tough. That was tough. And
can you dive deeper into the process of hiring? Because this is a very recurring topic. I think one of the most top asked questions that I get is, how do you hire a sales team or salespeople, and then add it to that in this country or in this region? So could you share maybe more in detail, like how that process for you was? What are red flags? What were good things?
Yeah, you're bringing up an important point, because I was doing it definitely at that stage. I just come to the US, 6-12 months before. And everybody warns you for this, right? Yeah, people look the same. They all speak English. You've traveled there your whole life. it's very different to live there and really do business there as an American company. So I think it was the discipline I didn't know much about to sort of sniff out who would be the right people, until later. I definitely benefited from this in my second company, by the way, and doing it in a culture that is really very different and where people communicate very differently, right? If you're used to the more, let's say, North Sea direct communication styles, and then you come to the US where you think people will probably do the same. Well, turns out not to be true, and then it varies per region even. And we were trying to build a national sales force here in the US. So a lot of hard lessons there. At some point, I started leaning more on people who had done it on the board, asking for help, even as part of the interview process, using specialized recruiters. I guess had to make my mistakes as well.
So you went to the board and specialized recruiters. Were you eventually able to do it yourself? And if so, what did that hiring funnel look like?
Well, I'm trying to think back on. We made our first hires in 2004-05. So this was very recently after that acquisition of the US company, and after moving basically the headquarters of the group to California. But then we did our biggest expense of the sales force in 2006, 2007, and by that time we really tried to go national. So we hired about 30 people. By that time I had a very good VP of sales. It was a he. He drove a lot of that and brought in a lot of connections, people he had already worked with, which in this traditional business that we were in turned out to be pretty critical. And I still see that. Now let's fast forward. What are we, 15, 16 years later? It's still the case in that domain. So some of the startups we've invested in, I can now bring that to the table, that, how important is it that these relationships exist between, the leadership in sales, the salespeople, the people in the field, and the surgeons we were serving, and that a lot of the startups we invest in are serving. So it turned out to be very much a relationships business, not so much a skills business.
So pretty much you need to just find one really good one, and this person needs to be connected to all the other potential people that he or she can hire.
And that one really good one, because I've made a few mistakes there as well, you have to make sure that there is a longer term alignment, that it's not too transactional, which driven by money or stock options, but very opportunistically. I made a couple of mistakes there as well. Not making the right judgment call on what drives a person.
So do you then look at somebody because they want to be with your company and the mission, or you're looking at their core values and morals?
Well, I would say I've learned to appreciate getting to know a person and their core values as best as I can. You're talking about maybe, for senior leadership positions, 2, 3, 4 rounds of talks, maybe a dinner to get out of a formal environment a little bit. So it's always hard. But the values are really important. Honesty, communication styles, getting along enough that you can have an open, direct communication with somebody. And the first one you mentioned as well, I need to see an alignment with what we're doing. And then thirdly, the money, the comp, the upside needs to be good. It doesn't have to be splashy or excellent. That can actually be a distraction in its own right. But if you talk about percentiles in the market, if you're aiming for success, you should not. This is maybe also what I learned. It's good to be scrappy in startups, and you have to. But for some things, you really have to pay, and especially when you get to commercialization, you do have to pay. It's a very competitive environment, and it is to some extent driven by making money.
So pretty much as a founder who's ready to hire a sales team, focus on just hiring one good VP of sales and pay a lot for that.
Be prepared to pay a lot for that if that person actually delivers, and make sure there's a good combination between short-term and mid-term and long-term compensation alignment. Yeah.
I like that. Very detailed answer. Thank you. One of the things you also covered that I was interested in was the investor relationship. So you mentioned going to the board, all that stuff. One of the things that I tend to get asked, because we get a lot of beginning startups that don't have investors, they read the books, hear the stories, the podcasts, everything. But what is it exactly like from your perspective, maybe throughout all of your startups? What is the investor relationship like? What does a startup need to look out for when accepting money? And how does that become different from the beginning stages to all the way IPO?
Yeah, this is a big question.
We have time.
Yeah, no, I know. I find this very refreshing of your approach. We have time. So I like venture capital as it was started, which was people who had run companies, who had run startups. And I don't know how far you want to go back, but you can probably go back to the 60s, 70s, when you sort of saw that first crowd of venture capital originating, probably mostly in this country, actually, who wanted to have more impact than one company at a time, who started putting some of their own money that they had made in startups, but not necessarily to make a killing on every investment, but also driven by wanting to transfer their experience, their knowledge. I still believe that is the best type of investor you can have, especially in the earlier stages. People, who've felt your challenges, who've lived your pain, who've also had your successes, but who've also probably had a moment where there was no more money for next payroll, and what do you do then, right? So who can empathize with what you're going through, but are also playing their role, right? So sometimes I see people leaning very much and very long on angel investors, where they're really driven by other things, like having something meaningful to do in their lives, which is great, right? But you have to find also a level of professionalism, I think, with people who want to be an investor and want to play that role on a board, for instance. I like to think about it, nose in, know what's going on, have your ear to the ground, but keep your fingers out, unless you have to intervene. Something is really going wrong, and then you have to be very decisive. And most people there, on the investor side, wait too long then to do something. So this might sound contradictory, but anyway, going back to the investor question, that is especially in the earlier phases. And then as you grow as a company, you go to your B round, your C round. At some point you may go public. Then you also want to see in your cap table probably investors who are ready for that next stage, who can think a little bit more purely financial, less operational, because by that time, hopefully in your company, you've built your team, you have that experience in the company, you don't need the board for that as much, but it would still be good if the investors are on the board, and they usually are, especially in the beginning, to have people there who have experience, who have who can actually help coach maybe some of you or your team members as founders, without being the people who tell you what to do the whole time, because that's how they did it, right? So they need to have grown. They need to have gone through their personal development journey as well, and accept what role they play now. I've seen good and bad on that in my own startups, but fast forwarding to what we do now at DSM Venturing, this is really what we try to do, right? For our portfolio companies, is have a team of people who can be board members on their companies, who are not necessarily, best friends with the management teams the whole time, but who can play that role and not play the role of some investors who you also see, and I've also experienced, who are just in it for the money and who think in zero-sum notions. So if they take more percentage of shares, then it has to come from you as the founder. So now we're going to start looking for every reason, every little mistake, every deviation from plan as a reason to make your share smaller, so my share gets bigger, right? That is the type of investors I don't really care for, and it often comes through greed, inexperience, having maybe purely financial training, coming out of MBA school, running everything by spreadsheets. Be careful with that, I would say, to founders.
That's actually a really good question that I wanted to ask right now, which is, how do you explain to a founder? I've met a lot of venture capital firms, and some of them have pretty much students that just graduated and decide whether a startup is a fit or not. Now, in some cases, they have good reputations, these venture capital firms, and sometimes I even refer people to them. But how do you explain, after what you just said, how do you explain to a founder that those people are there and should be there? Why is it not all people that have 20 years of experience? And am I missing something? Like, are those people supposed to be there? Are they not supposed to be there? Should they first have a career before they go into a venture capital firm? Can you share your opinion? And
well, I understand why the VC firms want to have that leverage, right? Because they're, if you look at the amount of money going into venture capital year on year, even in the last decade, it's staggering, the numbers. Even this year, I read something like 216 billion year to date went into VC funds from institutional investors, compared to 150 last year. The numbers and then all the stories about unicorns, etc. So it is logical that if there's so much money chasing startups, that there's not enough experienced people that can take care of every single step in every single investment. So you get a leverage model with multiple layers of people. And that this is not necessarily bad, and that somebody had that training, and that at the first start of their career, that's the only training they've had, and now experience needs to kick in. That's not bad either. But then you hope that the firm's culture and the way they interact with each other, with the partners, is such that that people can make small mistakes commensurate to their experience level. But at some point, that somebody will help them, and that way, firms can operate. Especially, I think, if firms are really deep into healthcare, for instance. So they really have a lot of expertise in the firm, and work in a collegial way. I think this can work. It's a bit of a long answer to say I'd be careful, but I wouldn't necessarily immediately say this is not good enough. Now, if you have a startup and you do have access to the partner with the operating background and 20 years experience, and you can get there, you can get the money there, that is probably more helpful.
I really like how to the point your answers are. Probably the Dutch side. So you just shared, obviously, your first startup story. Can you maybe share kind of the second startup story that you went into after the IPO? You mentioned you needed to take a break. I actually want to zoom into that break. Why and how long was your break, and what did you do during that break? Because what I tend to notice, and I have to be honest, I also experienced something like this when we've achieved massive success. There's like an emptiness almost that happens where you don't really know what to do, and it's almost, and I think the mistake that tends to happen is that you jump too quickly into something else that you're not supposed to be doing. So can you talk a little bit more about that break before the second startup? What were your thought processes like? How long was it? And could you share that?
Yeah, you're making such a great point, and yep, guilty. Um, this is, so let me first say, I was planning to take a year and a half, and the I already mentioned before, the exit wasn't all glamorous, right? So it was decent. Some people would argue that it was not good for earlier shareholders or other categories of shareholders, but we did okay. But my point is, I had no intention to not work for 5 years, and I would not be able to afford that. So I was thinking, okay, a year. Why was I thinking that? Because a lot of people warned me and told me, hey, you're going to get bored. You're a very active guy. And yep, that all happened. So it was a bit of a black hole, to be honest. I was sitting at home and trying to get busy because that's my MO. I now know this 20 years later. That's what I do. And sometimes you need to go through that and accept that you stare in, it's not an abyss like something horrible is going to happen, but it feels indeed empty. And that adrenaline rush that you've been in, that I had been in for 10 years, which was pretty crazy at times, it's gone. And you wake up and we lived in Laguna Beach, California, beautiful nature. So yeah, I could do all those things, and I did. But I felt a little bored and empty, etc. So when opportunities did arise, I had to tell myself, no, don't do it. You're closed for business right now. But then one showed up, and it was people I knew who were involved, and they were pretty convincing, and it was a very good IP portfolio, basically, that could be transformed in a startup. And I remember I thought, okay, let's make this a semi-break. I'm going to go to a conference in Hong Kong on this topic, and let's see what I think. And then I got hooked. So the break, which was intended to be 12 to 18 months, maybe lasted 5 months. And I was really happy to go, find an engineer and then rent a small office and get back into adrenaline rush mode. Were there signs? If you ask my wife, she warned me several times. Also, then I don't want to go too deep into that, but with the kind of investors I ended up being with, there were signs on the wall that was going to be difficult. And I did this and I plowed forward. Comes with the age as well, I guess, right?
When you then went out of that startup, did you take a break then?
Yeah.
So that was your second break. Can you describe that one? Obviously, you had the experience now of a break as well. How did you handle this break different? And I guess my question is, how did you make sure that you didn't end up in that emptiness? Or if you did end up, how did you get out of it? Because at the end of the day, I'm speechless when somebody asks me. I don't know how to do that unless get busy, and that's not a good answer usually.
Yeah. So that was not a break after an exit. So there was definitely not. It ended up being about a year, and I consulted for other companies, but I felt I needed to take responsibility to my family and bring in a livelihood basically for us. So that had a totally different nature. On the one hand, that sense of urgency kept me going. On the other hand, that was a tough period. That was really a tough period. I don't consider it a break.
Then I'm happy that you also covered that, because then I guess my question is, you did experience a ton of success on the first one, and then on the second one, from what I'm hearing, it went a bit worse. So during that break, you had to, bring in livelihood. How do you deal with the mindset as you go through that, being such a success, you're capable, but yet you're in this position that you were in. How do you get yourself out of it? How do you accept? Like, what was your thought process, I guess?
Now I was forced basically to do all those things, go through. It was almost a bit of a mourning cycle, almost, and ultimately getting to acceptance, and the concept. So I used resources. I found some people who could really help me there.
Like what type of people?
Coaches. I started a meditation practice, spent a lot of time outside. It was not an easy period, to be honest. But the concept of accountability, true accountability, that's really where I got that in that period, which is, ultimately, it doesn't matter that the world's not fair, or that there's people who you don't like, who did nasty things, in your opinion. It matters what you do, and how you deal with that. And you always have choices there. And that was a big lesson in that. It was also a big lesson that, we had a really nice lifestyle, and we decided for a while to turn that back, to make sure that we had enough runway to get started again. And this is in the American system a little different than in Europe, right? A lot of things immediately stop existing, health insurance, stuff like that. So you're very mindful that, and this was also the crisis, right? The years after the crisis. So we saw people in our environment who went from really the high life to skipping town, is the expression.
Wow.
They left because they couldn't pay the bills anymore. So it was an interesting period. I'm actually, I learned a lot. So I'm grateful to have gone through it and coming out in a decent way. But I wouldn't call it a break.
What were the biggest learning lessons, and then also how did it eventually finish?
Get out of your comfort zone with what you've always done was a big lesson, and trust a little bit the process with people who know what they're doing, not necessarily what I knew I was doing. And I still apply that regularly, actually, that I think, I don't want to do this. This doesn't make any sense. And then, but these people are actually quite good. So let's give it the benefit of the doubt. Let's try that. Accept the fact that accepting takes time. So I think anyone who, gets a setback like that, whether it's in business life or in personal life, stuff happened there as well at some point later, accept that it's not going to be a quick fix. It's going to take time, and it all has to get internalized in yourself before you can really deal with it. You can survive, you can do stuff, you can be very effective, maybe in a sort of crisis mode, but to really see it as a personal growth opportunity almost, you need to internalize it. And that takes time, and it takes effort. It's work.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big lesson.
How did the period eventually finish? What was the transition in your mind looking back?
Well, big question I had for myself is, am I going to go and do another startup? The field, I had done the first two in the biomedical field, medical field, not therapeutic biotech field, but physical stuff, right? After 2008, had really a big drought of venture capital, and a lot of people, including Sequoia Capital, who came out with that report at the time, thought those days were just going to be over. Now we know it's not the case. But I was thinking about through all those things, and I was also thinking, okay, and this is how I ended up with corporate venture capital. I don't want to be a venture capitalist. Just don't want to. Not purely financially driven. There's more in life. So I saw a future shortfall in the innovation pipeline for large companies because of a smaller supply of startups. And then again, startups in the physical world, right? Not tech, not biotech, therapeutic. And to get that pipeline filled, that the corporates would have to play a bigger role in filling it. And that with my first career and my second career combined, I could probably be quite good at that. So started talking to a number of corporations. In the meantime, I was consulting startups, helping them get off the ground. So I got back into having fun that way, and talked to a few startups in California. And then the people I knew at DSM at some point got in touch again. And it turned out they already were doing this for 20 years, or at that time 10 years. And that's how I ended up there. But I wanted to fill that pipeline and have more impact than one startup at a time by being able to play a portfolio approach and bringing the things that I had learned with a team of people that I in the meantime hired to startups.
Because that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you at the beginning, which is, how did you make that transition going from startup to an investor? And also, what changes with your mindset when you sit on the other side of the table? Are you still, that startup entrepreneur, or is there a completely different skill set?
Yeah, it goes back a little bit to what I said earlier. Sometimes I get the itch. And I have to catch myself not to try play the startup entrepreneur in comments I make in a board meeting, for instance, or one-on-one with founders. So it is really you play a different role, and you have to be very mindful of that, I think, to be good at it. Fortunately, in DSM, and there was so much that drew me to DSM, and this is one of the things: is we as a company, the company has transformed over 100 plus years, right? And as part of that transformation, the experimenting with startup models also internally, that opportunity, especially in the last few years, was and is also there. So sometimes, we can get a little bit more hands-on rather than purely playing a board investor role. But on the investment side, that's what you need to do. You need to play your role. That's what you're there for. And don't start telling the CEOs exactly what to do, because that's how you did it.
Yeah. For the listeners, maybe, obviously I researched what DSM does. Can you explain DSM? Can you explain DSM in a way that it's a very complicated company in a simple way, so not too long?
Well, here's the good news. It's becoming a simpler company. So the company DSM stands for, in Dutch, the state mines, but it's a good acronym because we can also say in English Dutch state mines. So it was a coal mining company. So in energy, if you will, and at the time, that kind of energy was a transition from previous kinds of energy, right? So when the coal mines closed, DSM decided to transform itself more into the chemical industry, and then into fine chemical industry. And in the last few years, we've really transitioned to become much more of a biotech company that focuses on nutrition, health, and care. And the care goes, all three go for humans, for animals, for the planet. And we are also a for-profit business, so it has to be in balance with taking care of the shareholders as well. And this is where, especially at this stage of my life and the last 10 years, I really feel a connect that it's top-notch business as well as mission-driven, and those two can go together. So that's what DSM is now really becoming, a nutrition and healthcare company. We're I'm not sharing anything that's not public. We're openly getting out of the materials businesses, out of the the older chemical businesses, and really focusing on how are we going to deal with the lack of resources for humankind with a population of 10 billion people in 2050. On the nutrition side, on the way we feed ourselves and what we need to grow for that, how we grow it in agriculture and animals. So we're really looking at future technologies to help make that a manageable cause and not destroying the earth while we're at it.
So then your role within DSM, they asked you to join. When you joined, obviously you had been a consultant and an entrepreneur. You've had your career before that, but I don't think you've ever been an investor before that, right? So what are the first days like? What are the first steps like? How is it different? Are you kind of building your own team, or can you explain to someone what that transition is like and what the practical things you were doing in the first weeks or days?
Yeah. No, I'd never been an investor before, but I'd worked for an investment firm for a while in the first 10 years. And in the startups, I always dealt with investors and I invested my own money. So, I had an idea of returns and that kind of stuff. But you're absolutely right. I never worked for a big company. And a lot of my friends said, you're going to go completely nuts there. Everything is going to be slow.
Yeah, that's what I keep hearing.
Yeah, exactly. But this is where, and there, believe me, I've had my moments and sometimes still do. It is a large company. We're 25,000 people. The largest company I'd been with was the one I was running, which was 300 people. But most of the time I'm under 100, right? But you start seeing, and maybe it's experience or getting a little older, or I don't know. You start seeing more the systemic parts of it. So if what a large company that is open-minded to experiment things can have as an impact is actually, I now conclude, and I had the feeling that was going to be the case when I joined, is huge. And we need it desperately. So to your question, what was I doing practically? First, get to know the team that was already there, get to know the businesses, get to talk to almost anyone I could find who would give me an hour because they were running a corporate venture group somewhere else. And in my exploration into that area, I'd spoken to quite a few people already in the US, so I didn't have to start from scratch there. And do the typical, hey, what works, what doesn't work kind of stuff. And so within the first year, developed a completely new strategy. The first assignment I gave myself was basically saying, is this ever going to really work in a large corporation? In the sense that, do we bring anything to the company that's going to have an impact for the company? Or is it relatively, remote from the business, small fry kind of stuff? And so we designed a strategy to do exactly that, which required an overhaul of the team. Instead of making it a corporate career path of 3 years rotation to go through the venturing group, we started looking for people who wanted that to be their career and who already brought 20 plus years. The first hires were all very senior people to bear, exactly to be able to build a reputation among startups and other VCs that we were not the typical corporate people. We were trying to build a bridge to the corporate culture and to the startup at the same time. So building the team, and then, you go through cycles in a company, also financially. So in one of the first years, there were cash flow constraints. So we couldn't invest a whole lot, but it gave us a great opportunity to start building a pipeline. And then we started investing. And in the beginning, we really set investment targets. And some people said, well, if you do that, are you still going to look at quality, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah, but yes, you do. But you also have to get started. You can't analyze everything for 3 years. That's not the pace of startups and financing rounds. You at some point you have to take positions. And increasingly over the years, I think we've gotten better at it, closer to the business, built a real portfolio, and it is now really ingrained in the DNA of DSM to always think about what can we do with external parties, what can we do with startups, not just focus on what we can do internally.
So I feel like the common trend, if I hear your story, is you were hiring great people. And so here again, when you did the overhaul, you were hiring different types of people than normal people would expect. So what kind of people were you hiring, and how big was the initial team like?
Yeah, the team size was, I think when I joined it was about 8 or something, and we're at 12 now. So we haven't gone through tremendous growth. We have gone through tremendous growth of how much money we invest and how many startups we invest in. We now have a portfolio of about 40 companies. I think when I joined it was maybe 10 or 15. And some of them had been sitting there quite a while. We now do 10 new deals a year. We do 20 follow-ons a year. When I just had joined, people weren't thinking about follow-ons, quite frankly. They celebrated the first investment as the big success.
What is a follow-on?
In venture capital and also in modern corporate venture capital, if you will, you step in at round seed or A, and now the last 10 years, we also reserve for the next rounds, not to be diluted out and to continue to play a role with some impact. Which means, a follow-on is as much work almost as the initial investment. So you need to staff up for that as well. So we started looking, and the other thing in the strategy, which was new probably, the company was pretty Euro-centric, but the availability of good startups was mostly in the US. So people would travel and invest. And I had a strong conviction that this, like most businesses, is also a local business with local ecosystems. You want to be part of those ecosystems. Where are the biggest startup ecosystems in the world? It's California, it's the Northeast here. There's more now, but that was definitely then the case. And still, if you look at the amount of money that gets invested, those are number 1 and 2. And then there's So we needed to be there. We needed to have our own people there, and who would be known for what they had done previously, to be trustworthy, good people, helpful people. And people also need to know that you're going to be around for a next deal, for a next round. So you can't be treated like, let yourself be treated like a newbie who comes to town and we're going to take their money, thank you, and bye-bye. And that I still see sometimes with companies who start in a different continent, greenfielding, that they don't fully grasp that. So we hired very experienced people with a startup background, investor background, and enough social skills to speak with a large corporation that we're part of, and who were part of an existing ecosystem.
I like that. Is the original team that you hired, so not the original team, but the after one that you hired, are all of them still there, or have some of them transitions like a corporate after 3 years?
I think, except for 2, they're all still there. One concluded very quickly into it that it wasn't the right choice.
So they're really into it as a career.
And one was I this is what I always did in the startups, and I'm trying to do it here as well. I like interns, young people who come and sniff at it and see if we can find a match. There's a higher turnout rate. Some we are hired, but some decided to go for different career paths or different geographies than where we were hiring. But almost everybody who joined is still there. And that was, you can never plan much further than maybe 3 or 5 years. But for me, it's important that people commit to a whole investment cycle, like 10 years.
How did you do that? Maybe a very general question, but you can never predict people's behavior, especially I've learned running my business for like almost 8 years now. like 3 years in like a human cycle is like so long, especially their career nowadays is so long. What did you sniff out? What were you looking out for that you could see these people staying for long?
Yeah, great question. Well, let's start with the very experienced ones that were the hires in the beginning. At some point, that level of experience allows for a very direct conversation, right? Exactly around this topic. This is what we're trying to do. Is there a fit? Is this what you want to be part of? And let's talk about how we can. It's as much as me selling the concept as somebody selling themselves to be a good candidate, right? So it's about very honest and open conversations about it, which in different cultures are different conversations to be had. It's spending enough time, and then I think if you would ask the team, and I do ask the team, what drives them to still be there and do this is we do a lot. So we're not just sitting there practicing or something. We do a lot of deals. It's a fun job. It really is a fun job, and part of that is the activity, right? And the other important part of that is that it's a very diverse team, and people really like to be with each other, which is very hard during COVID, by the way, and especially since we hired 3-4 new people. But we always made a big point out of at least 3 times a year spending 3-4 days together, and a lot of quality time.
Maybe another question then, which is related to, and it's clear in this conversation, you clearly have this itch which many entrepreneurs have. What is it like to have a job now? And is it like, I guess the most common question is, I don't have that question right now, I'm pretty happy, but I can imagine in 20 years from now, or maybe in 10 years, I exit, and a lot of people, I've never had a job, people are like, you wouldn't cut it in a job, like you wouldn't be able to do the 9 to 5. The fact that I have to get up very early is already a killer. but what is it like to have a job after having had that roller coaster? Is it worth it? Is it better to still chase freedom through startups, or?
Yeah, it's okay. I'm 56, right? I've been in business now for since 33-4 years, whatever. I know there is no absolute freedom, except maybe for a very few people. But then they will have their own problems as well. You know, if you're extremely wealthy, that you have total freedom from a financial perspective, there's probably some other things you have to worry about, right? So, the job gives a lot of freedom as well. The job I have, I'm lucky, right? But a lot of autonomy. In how we do things, the fit and the alignment, and sometimes it is really tough, is more on what and why and consistency in that, and not changing that because people changed in a business, for instance, right? That's sometimes can be very frustrating, and sometimes indeed slow decision processes because there's so many people involved. But I also see the value of that often. So. Yeah, for me it works, and I think after a certain number of years of experience, it becomes rather simplistic to think very black and white about it. Like a job is not freedom, and a startup is freedom. Hey, in a startup you have a board, you have investors, you have people working there. There's
and usually you work more hours than a job as well.
Well, now this is going to be, that's what I sort of expected, and I was also quite frankly ready for it. And I sometimes hear from people joining DSM, it's not the case. People work very hard actually at all hours, and so if there's a certain amount of, I think it comes down to passion, right? If people are passionate about what they do, and there's a lot of passion in this company, then they will work hard, not because they're told to do it, but because they see opportunity and they know they can achieve something really meaningful.
When you got the job, were you able to put on some requirements like I'm working autonomously, let me do my thing and trust me, or were there already some guidelines? I guess what I'm asking is, was it a job, or was it because of your experience that you were allowed to become this little startup within the corporate?
Yeah, it was a job um, with my but so my predecessors had mostly been long-term DSM executives um, living near the center of power. So the first it wasn't a battle, but the first like little thing was, okay, so you're gonna come live in the Netherlands, right? And I was like, I don't think we want that. uh, because that's not where the startups are, especially not near the head office of DSM, which is in the south of the Netherlands. There are some, but you go for the low-hanging fruit, right? So, and that would definitely be the US. But then we reached an agreement. I said, okay, I need to get to know the company, so I'll take an apartment. I'll spend a good amount of time here to learn the inside of the company. But let's have a discussion in 9 months what we're going to do, and that's when we decided as a family, but also with DSM. It's a global role, so East Coast is easier to manage with the time zones, and so I moved from California to Boston, and there were other reasons for that as well. So yeah, I guess I had a level of autonomy, maybe because of my previous experience, and that they were really looking for. And yeah, I'm not shy to voice my views. If it hadn't worked, if I had been forced to do things that I really would have found making no sense, I wouldn't have been there very long. So it was really a dialogue.
I really like that through your stories. I'm really getting to know kind of the culture that is going there, and it's actually been my experience with the good corporates in the Netherlands that they've kind of very comfortable culture to be around, which I guess is partially their personality as well. But I want to maybe talk a little bit more about DSM then, or maybe specifically then what you do. Could you tell me more about some of the startups that you guys have been investing in? What has that experience been like? Maybe some success stories. Always interesting to hear. We sometimes have investors listening in.
Yeah, so we really focus now on cutting edge new technology, as well as business models, and often more and more integrating digital aspects in nutrition for humans, for animals, and some examples. In this year, we invested in a company in cultured meat. So how can we, instead of growing animals who use a lot of water and need to be fed a lot of feed that needs to be grown as well, can we make meat in a fermentation process, in a bio reactor process? Now, a lot of people start feeling uncomfortable with that concept, but it actually comes back pretty closely to my first startup, which was also tissue engineering, right? You're creating cells. So, and it's a very hot space. There's almost 100 startups in the world now really focusing on that. And where a company as DSM can play a role is to help them scale, because often on a small scale they're able to grow something, but it's completely unaffordable because it's using pharma grade ingredients that are also manufactured at a small scale. So there's a good business reason why we could be helpful there, and it's a great investment area with a lot of potential growth. So it's just one example. Another example where we built a portfolio actually since a few years ago is personalized nutrition. So a lot of people benefit from nutritional supplements, if you have deficiencies in certain vitamin levels or live in a certain part of the world or have a certain age or a certain lifestyle, da, 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 da. But it's very hard to determine what you need or what I need on any given day. And we set out a few years ago, 4 years ago, on seeing, we have a lot of those ingredients in DSM, and we like to sell them, obviously. But we'd like to sell them to people who actually use them as well and need them as well. So can we make with, diagnostics, with wearables, with AI, can we, with mixing devices, with new delivery systems, new formulations, can we make a play there and play and be a leader in that space, which everybody finds very interesting. But if you look at the big companies, almost nobody's entering that space. The large consumer packaged good companies. So we did, and we invested in a number of startups, and actually we created our own 100% almost owned startup in DSM. Just came back from a board meeting yesterday here in the US to go direct to consumer with a number of those concepts. So those are really the exciting new things that will have a lot of benefit if they're successful. I can go on and on, but in reducing. With COP26 going on right now, reducing, increasing the sustainability of how things are made. Biotech can play a huge role there, and DSM has a very strong original core in biotech, actually in the Netherlands, in Delft, but also in other parts of the world. So there's tremendous opportunity for people who can bring all these disciplines together and then frame them in a way that is more precisely targeted to, even if you're in a B2B business, which we largely are, to consumers, to the ultimate users.
I guess we're kind of nearing the end, but before that, I want to ask you a question about, you have now experienced startups, and we've covered that, and now as an investor, you've invested so many times. You've also advised the startups. You've done it now, I think, 40 plus times. So what are the most common problems that you see happen that if people are listening, you would like to share with them? And obviously solutions to that.
Yeah, the most common and also potentially most devastating problems is when it's the wrong mix of people. A lot of investors say this, and a lot of us mean it. We invest in teams ultimately, right? The technology is important, the IP is important, the market opportunity, it's all important. But the wrong mix of people doing it, and that includes, by the way, the investors on the cap table and the people in the board, can really mess up very good opportunities. And an excellent combination of people can really, out of something mediocre maybe even, create a big success, because they will get at it and go at it and change it and make it something great. So I cannot, I'm looking for the right word here. Emphasize enough how important that is. And especially when it's deep tech, it is sometimes overlooked by people who are really looking for the next winner on the technology side. It's not a judgment call, but I think also when you're in this business, you need the right mix of people working on that. You need the technology people, you need the people who look at the human aspect, you look at people who look at the financial aspects, the business aspects, everything. It's a bit of a wide answer to your question, I think. So
yeah, I was going to say it's pretty general. I hear that a lot. You've actually experienced it as an entrepreneur. Obviously, the first time was good founder, second time a bit less. So can you then say, somebody's a founder, they're either looking for a co-founder or they're having doubts about their fellow co-founders. Can you point them in the right direction of what is it that could be bad about the co-founders that isn't right? What are red flags they should be looking out for? Or on the other side, what are really good flags that they're like, okay, I'm very happy that this is happening?
Yeah, if you ask the question that way, my inclination would be to start answering in terms of attributes of individuals. And I don't want to do that because, yes, there are some attributes that you probably are looking for in individuals, but it is really the mix, it's the team. So I've seen, and I'm in a few scenarios now actually, where everybody individually is really superb, best quality you can get, but the combination doesn't work or is not optimal, right?
Why not?
Excuse me?
Why not?
Well, that I don't want to go into amateur psychology here, but often okay, if I would found a company again now, I would really deeply try to get a hypothesis in my own mind what drives the people I'm going to work with. And whether that's patterns that come back from the way they are genetically built or where they were raised or the experiences they've had in their life afterwards, professionally or personally, that is, for me, what I look for. Now, often it's very hard to find out, right? People, it can be very impolite to ask about certain things. In some countries, it may be illegal to ask about certain things, but I need a hypothesis, right? And then it can turn out to be wrong, but I cannot mindlessly just go and look at some attributes like, oh, this person has been successful, or I feel so good being around this person. I really get a lot of energy, or, things that probably in my younger years I thought were the criteria. No, it's really the team. It has to, nobody can do something alone in a startup.
So to quickly summarize for me, because we're having someone who's experienced, and I keep hearing it, and it's so general and so vague. But for me to summarize, then what you are looking for is not all people the same. They have to be diverse. They have to be different. And I guess from what you're saying, having discussions and debates because of that. But at the end of the day, in their heart, they have to be on the same mission.
Yes, and you can talk about that a lot, and you have to, and then you form that hypothesis in your head. We don't go as far as to do assessments on teams or write it all out, but we try also as an investment team to form an opinion on what makes people tick. Why are they doing this? Are those the motivations that we can align with, and how does it go between the different team members? And then it's really a matter of seeing what actually happens. It's not the words. And if you see, and I say this now as an investor, but I would also say it as a CEO or a founder. If you, the moment you feel that something is not right, it's usually really not right. And then you probably have all these biases because you made a decision to hire somebody that, no, I must have it wrong. Let's explore a little further. And I'm not saying, shoot from the hip with things, but if you really deeply feel based on your experience and your observations, and you have to be factual about it, that it's not working, then there is usually something that needs to be repaired.
I like that. And so quickly before, so what is your thought then, or have you seen successful sole founders then? Because you keep mentioning teams. What about sole founders?
Who are the whole startup without anyone around them?
No, they have a team, obviously. Otherwise, a startup wouldn't grow. But it's like there's only one founder because they started the business and they kept growing it, and when they started making money, started getting employees.
Yeah, that can happen. It's rare in my experience that people are really, really exceptionally good at all stages you have to go through, but it does happen actually. I can think of a few examples where there was a sole technical founder who turned out to become a really good business person. But the odds are against it, I would say, generally speaking. This is one of the things I actually like. I'm looking that way because MIT is that way. They really seem to have a knack of finding, even in their student population and definitely in their staff, a lot of multidisciplinary talented people. So not only technology, which is top notch, obviously, but also with emotional intelligence and a certain drive and a communication skill and sometimes multiple technical things, and especially if those are converging in that startup, then sole founders can work. But I'm also a strong believer that nobody should be doing something too long without refreshment. And this goes for politics and government, but it also goes for startups. Now, most startups are not around long enough to really see that happen, but sometimes they do actually.
As we're kind of ending the end, what are some last thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, you had a lot of questions about my transformations or transitions, if you will, and I've become more thoughtful with them, but I never very long processes of jumping into something different, and it was always because I really. It fit with my values. It felt good with the people, and I obviously could see the business case. And then, this I would probably say this: there's a time to analyze things, and then you make a decision, and then you go do it for a while, and don't second guess at every turn. Take a few years to just put your head down, work. And then come up again and think about, hey, does this work? Is this what I want to do? And I think that would be true for a lot of circumstances that probably a lot of your listeners are going through as they go through their lives.
I really love that advice, actually. It's really good. Thank you. I want to roll out the red carpet for you. Is there anything you'd like to share? Where can people find you? Please share more.
Yeah, no, I'm not on a mission here. I was intrigued by the opportunity to have this conversation with you, and I enjoy doing it. So I hope there is some nudges in here that people will benefit from.
Great, thank you so much for sharing, and I really hope people got a lot out of it, just like I did. See you maybe on a next episode.
Very good. Have a good rest of your day.
If you liked this episode, you can check out our most recent one here. And if you haven't already, make sure you click here to subscribe and see the next one. But if you're interested in more tips and tricks, then make sure to join our Facebook group where you can find thousands of like-minded people and you get direct access and support to